We did not take action to start a war.
Donald Trump defends the assassination of Iran's top military leader, but critics say the US president has made the world a more dangerous place. How will the killing of Qassem Soleimani affect American troops abroad? And will it trigger another endless war? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Halla Mohieddeen. The US president has long said he'd pull American troops out of what he called the endless wars in the Middle East. But Donald Trump's critics say he may just have laid the groundwork for a new conflict. Funerals have been held for Iran's military commander, Qassem Soleimani, who died in a US airstrike in Iraq on Friday. Armed groups in the Middle East, supported by Tehran, are promising revenge. The US is urging Americans to leave Iraq immediately and is sending extra troops to the region in case of reprisal attacks. And while Trump's Republican Party has praised the targeted killing of Soleimani, the Democrats are not happy, as Heidi Jo Castro reports.
President Donald Trump tried to justify his decision to order the killing of Iranian Revolutionary Guard commander Qassem Soleimani by claiming Soleimani had been planning imminent and sinister attacks on Americans in the region.
We took action last night to stop a war. We did not take action to start a war.
The U.S. president said Soleimani was responsible for the deaths of thousands of American service people over 2 decades.
Soleimani has been perpetrating acts of terror to destabilize the Middle East for the last 20 years. What the United States did yesterday should have been done long ago.
Trump's Republican allies in Congress agreed.
For too long, this evil man operated without constraint, and countless innocents have suffered for it. Now his terrorist leadership has been ended.
Democrats say Trump ordered the drone strike that also killed the leader of Tehran-backed Iraqi militia groups without consulting Congress and warned of serious consequences.
This is the equivalent of the Iranians assassinating the U.S. Secretary of Defense. I do not believe the administration has gamed out how very badly this could go for the U.S. and our interests.
This action may well have brought our nation closer to another endless war, exactly the kind of endless war the president promised he would not drag us into.
Iran has promised retaliation. The U.S. State Department issued a security alert urging all American citizens to leave Iraq immediately, despite the Secretary of State's claims on U.S. media that Americans in the region are now safer after Soleimani's demise.
While no one is accusing President Trump of ordering Friday's drone strike for political purposes, it does overshadow all political headlines in the U.S., including Trump's impending impeachment trial. The U.S. Senate was to begin this new year by taking on that as their first order of business. And instead, senators are preparing for briefings on the U.S. military strike and whatever response it may bring. Heidi Jo Castro, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, the US has maintained a military presence in the Middle East for decades. According to Central Commands, there are at least 60,000 troops in 20 countries. After Soleimani's killing, the US is sending an additional 3,000 to the region. Well, Iraq already has 5,000 troops following the war against ISIL. There are still nearly 900 soldiers in Syria. That's despite President Trump saying in October they were pulling out. Kuwait is home to more than 13,000 US military personnel, with an army headquarters, 2 air and 1 naval bases. 500 American soldiers were flown to Saudi Arabia last year because of increased tension with Iran. And Qatar has a huge US air base housing up to 13,000 troops. Well, let's bring in our guests now. Mann Leverett is CEO of the political risk consultancy Stratega and a former US diplomat. She joins us from Washington, D.C. In London, Andreas Krieg is an assistant professor in defence studies at King's College London and co-author of Surrogate Warfare, the Transformation of War in the 21st Century. Also joining us from Washington is Adolfo Franco, a Republican strategist and former advisor to Senator John McCain. Welcome to you all. We'll start in Washington, D.C. and with yourself, Mann Leverett. You've worked as a diplomat, you are a military strategist. This action taken by the Trump administration will have been gamed out to some extent. So what sort of impact do you think the US can expect from Iran? What sort of impact is the US braced for?
Well, from my understanding, when this has been gamed out, when a war with Iran is gamed out here in Washington in defense circles, the United States actually does not do very well. We are not able to, at the end of the day, really continue the escalatory dominance that you would need to win a war. The ability here, though, for the political elite to underestimate the strength of the Islamic Republic of Iran goes back 40 years. And my concern is that they still do not understand that going to war with Iran will be going to war against the most potent adversary that we have seen since World War II. It will be a difficult war for Iran if it comes to pass. I think they are ready, though, for this sacrifice, and I think many in Iran actually think they need to do so. They need to have a war with Iran to get the United States out of the Middle East. I do not think that President Trump and his political advisors really have any real understanding of what that type of war would be, what the cost would be politically and militarily to the United States and economically. The president, I think, was motivated largely by domestic political considerations here. Him and his Secretary of State, I think, were spooked into the possibility of another Benghazi.
OK, well, we'll come to the potential motivations perhaps later. Let's move along to Andreas Krieg. A bit of a doomsday scenario being painted there. What impact do you foresee? I mean, we are in a guessing game now. No one knows how Iran is going to respond. But what would you think is the likely scenario? Are we heading for World War III?
No, absolutely not. I mean, this hashtag World War III that was going around social media yesterday is completely blown out of proportion. I think this was an escalatory strike. It kind of brings us to a new trajectory in the region, particularly in Iraq. And it's a continuation of an ongoing standoff between the United States and Iran that is going back to early last year after the US unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA. This maximum pressure campaign is part of a type of war from an Iranian point of view, where the Iranians are telling you already we are at war with the United States. So the whole debate of we're going to war, we're already at a war which is below the threshold of an international armed conflict, but it is a war nonetheless. And I think we're going down a spiral of escalation where it is very, very important right now for the United States to make sure that the response that will come from the Iranians, and it has to come, and it will come not bound by geography or time, it will come at a time when we least expect it, and it can take a lot of different shapes and forms and probably will be executed by surrogates rather than directly by the Iranian military. But this kind of escalatory response that will come from Iran has to be under a certain threshold as well. It can't cross a certain red line because the Americans don't want to respond with further escalation. And I think what's important to note here is that the Americans via the Swiss embassy as well as via the Qataris have already tried to reach out to the Iranians to tell them, make sure that your response is going to be somewhat proportionate, that we can actually sit down and negotiate.
Well, in terms of a proportional response, we have had commentators, Andreas Krieg, putting it out there that the equivalent of Qassem Soleimani is someone at the level of Vice President Mike Pence. Do you think this was a proportional move from the United States? And if so, what is the proportional response to that?
No, I think it wasn't proportionate, but it was deliberately not proportionate in a way for the Americans to actually draw a red line. The problem is, and I agree with Hillary on this, the Trump administration doesn't have a strategy. It doesn't have an end goal. It doesn't have the means and ways to actually see this through. If you want to play this game, the Americans need to play this game with maximum military pressure as well. And that means with a political will to actually fight, willing to fight a major war in the region. I don't think the Americans are at this stage yet. But a response from the Iranians would be one that can be leveraged against any U.S. force in the region. In Syria and Iraq in particular, they're very vulnerable. It could be a drone strike. It could be kidnapping of U.S. soldiers, U.S. civilians, U.S. journalists in the region. And the Iranians have a network that goes beyond the MENA region. They can strike in Southeast Asia, in South America, in West Africa. This is where all these surrogate networks exist for the Iranians, and they can use these kind of attacks to respond against Americans when we least expect it. So a proportionate response means we have limited casualties, U.S. casualties, but there will be U.S. casualties because that would be the kind of proportionate response the Iranians want.
Okay, Adolfo Franco, let's start with in terms of the impact that the U.S. has braced for. The United States will have known that by taking out Qassem Soleimani, there would have been a reaction. Do you think the U.S. is well equipped to deal with that response at present?
Well, that largely depends on Iran. But I think we need to step back and ask how we got here and why this action was taken by the president. And I completely support the president. I do think he has a game plan. And the actions have been not only of the last 20 years, but most recently. Obviously, the most recent events, the attacks on our embassy orchestrated by Iran and its proxies in Iraq. What happened in Basra with respect to the death of American personnel, and of course the host of other things that have taken place in the region that have affected our interests and our allies. And the list is endless with respect to Soleimani and Iran, whether it's Syria, whether it's Lebanon, Yemen, attacks on Saudi Arabia's oil facilities. So the question is who provoked, who's been provoking, if you will, if you want to call the United States one of the sleeping giants, if you want to use that analogy. It's been Iran. So this is, the provocation has been Iranian provocation, and the response is appropriate. Here you have really a terrorist. He's not the equivalent of the vice president or the secretary of defense. These are outrageous comments. This is a terrorist. The Revolutionary Guard has been designated a terrorist by our government. You have a terrorist arriving in Baghdad to meet with his number one proxy, who was also an Iraqi taken out on this in this strike, to plot further attacks on our embassy, our personnel, and probably our bases in Iraq. So unlike the previous president, President Obama, there is a red line here, and the red line has been crossed, and this president has acted. And he not only has acted in this particular case, but has signaled that, as you mentioned, not only 3,500 troops coming to Iraq, but probably this enters into a new phase where the United States will probably re-engage to try to stabilize the situation in Iraq, which was rapidly deteriorating because of Iranian interference. Well, so I think we need to put this in the context of Iranian provocation and our need to respond. And I think Iran respects strength, and it appreciates weaknesses and exploits it, and it has been for a number of years. Well,
Iranians would perhaps argue, Adolfo Franco, that the provocation comes back to the United States with the overthrow of their democratically elected leader. But beyond leaving the blame to one side, we're here now. We're here now. Let's take a look at does this
because of Iran. We're here now because of Iranian actions, of course.
Well, that's one interpretation. But does this make life in the Middle East safer, particularly for Americans? Do you think that strike makes the situation for Americans in the Middle East safer?
It does, for this reason. With all due respect to Hillary and others, is we have a choice here. We either stand up to Iran and send the signals that we needed to send, which the president did, or we have a policy, frankly, of weakness and appeasement. And that's what was happening under the Obama administration. And I think you do draw to those analogies. Defense spending since the Obama administration's treaty with
George
Iran to try to limit its nuclear capabilities has increased 90%.
But it's not just, this isn't just Obama. President Bush had the chance to take out Soleimani as well and chose not to.
Correct. And he should have. Okay. And he should have. And President Trump has said very clearly this was long overdue, and it has been long overdue.
Okay, Hillary, Mann Leverett.
This was not a strategic decision taken by President Trump. Really? He is making the same mistake that is a bipartisan mistake that goes across political lines that both President Bush and President Obama made before him. You try to vilify a leader of another state, whether it's Saddam Hussein in Iraq or Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, which is what happened under Obama. You vilify this leader, you invade the country, try to destroy the country, and think you have a victory. That has been proven absolutely wrong. It is a strategic quagmire that has sucked the United States into the Middle East, drained our resources, killed our soldiers, and devastated those countries to no positive effect. We have Iraq under President Bush, where we had more than 100,000 troops there and have never been able to stabilize it. It is more anti-American today than it ever was. It's more of a threat to the United States today than it ever was.
Hillary,
the same thing with Libya that happens under President Obama. We have the exact same thing. Libya is more of a threat today than it ever was because of the U.S. military intervention.
Hillary,
it's not strategic.
You're making a quantum leap here.
Let me just make my final point on this issue. My final point on this issue is the last time that I was in Beijing, one of my Chinese counterparts said to me, the best thing the United States could do for China today is get itself dragged into yet another strategic quagmire in the Middle East. When we invaded Iraq back in 2003, that gave the Chinese a quiet decade to speed up every piece of their economic and military power, and look where we are today, on the cusp of yet again another strategically devastating defeat for the United States.
Okay, Adolfo.
Well, if I could, Hillary, if I could quickly, first of all, the last people I would take advice in terms of the formulation of American foreign policy would be Chinese communist diplomats, but you might have a different view on that regard. You are taking a quantum leap here to suggest for one moment that the United States is contemplating a war with Iran. I think the president has made it clear. I think Iran does not want a war. I don't think the United States is looking for a war with Iran. Obviously, when there are tensions and matters of this complexity, there's always the possibility of escalation. There is a risk. There's no question about that. But there is not a game plan, as you somewhat suggested, that we're now intervening. The interventions you mentioned, I grant, were probably poorly or not rightly executed. And I would share your view if indeed the goal here was to invade Iran and have regime change in Iran. This is not a leader. This is a terrorist. Our government has declared him a terrorist.
That's what's so sad. This
person is an Iranian
conflict.
Wait. Well, your strategy is the ostrich strategy.
And Saddam Hussein was a saint
certainly
for
doesn't work.
Right. If I could interject here, because this act has already happened.
Soleimani is a foreigner in Iraq.
Well, he's nothing anymore because he is now dead. Soleimani is now dead. Funerals are underway, and then it's time to look ahead. It's time to look ahead to the next step. If I could come to you, Andreas Krieg.
And celebrations as well.
Andreas Krieg, how do you see? We have one point of view that the US is not going to get dragged into a war, and another point of view that fears this is very much a reality. Do you think that there is a risk the US could get bogged down in this region, or is it time to cut and run?
It's not. Look, there has been a reshaping of U.S. engagement in the region under Obama already. Trump is just continuing this. And I think Trump is very much sincere to say he doesn't want to get dragged into another major combat operation. When we talk about war, we mean major combat operations. As I said, there is a war going on. We are in a conflict that turns violent, but it's a surrogate conflict. It's one where the Iranians don't fight with, with major combat operations, and where we don't fight with major combat operations. When I say say we, I mean the West. And in that respect, the Americans. Trump doesn't want to get dragged into a war because he doesn't have the capacity to do so. There are insufficient troops in the region to actually fight a major combat operation. None of the plans, none of the operational plans actually point in the direction of saying the US wants to invade Iran. The problem is, however, where is this spiral of escalation going to leave us if we don't enter into negotiations? And I think the plan, so I was at the Doha Forum a couple of weeks ago where we saw very senior people of the US administration actually directly talking with the Iranians. And it seemed that there is a pathway beyond the US presidential elections where the Iranians could talk to the Americans and try to find a negotiated way out of this. But obviously the government in Iran speaks with a different voice than the deep state in Iran, so the IRGC, the Quds Force, and so on. So, but there is a pathway forward for negotiation, and I do think that the Trump administration is sincere to say we do want to negotiate, but we have to put pressure as well. But he's taking a major risk here because the next retaliatory strike that might come from the other side might push the Americans to even escalate further. So we have to be very clear in terms of the strategy is where do we leave this spiral of violence and where do we actually sincerely talk and how much do we allow the Iranians to escalate without us escalating further. One other problem here is it is a major threat, it's a major risk that the Americans are facing very much on their own without their Western partners in Europe on their side, because the Europeans don't have a strategy either how to deal with Iran. And on the other hand, it's without the Gulf allies as well. The UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia are absolutely not interested in any sort of escalation, and they're quite fearful right now that a retaliatory strike by the Iranians might strike them right in the heart of the GCC. So in this context, the Americans are absolutely not ready or willing to actually go to war, to a major combat operation with the Iranians.
Adolfo Franco, if I could get your reaction to that, and quickly because we are running out of time. Are you concerned at all that the US appears isolated in its attempts to deal with Iran? And what would a victory look like to America at this stage?
Well, I don't think it's isolated. I don't believe it for one moment. Obviously, there are vested economic interests that Europeans have in Iran that make it more difficult, at least initially publicly, for European allies to rally around the U.S. position, which I think is being celebrated by all democracies. But I think the game plan here, and I don't disagree with the guest from London in large part, is one of, yes, negotiation and dialogue from strength. But the only thing the Iranians are going to understand, they have been provoking, they've been doing all kinds of activities in the region that have only can be characterized as terrorist activities. This is the only signal they will understand in terms of a negotiation. I don't think the U.S. wants a war. They don't want a war, but they are now going to retract, as they did in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, when real authority was exercised and real American power was exercised. And I think our allies are celebrating this, and certainly not. There are a lot of celebrations in Iraq as well as a consequence of this, not by Shia. I understand that, but a lot of other allies in the region now are gratified about the U.S. position of strength.
Okay, and the Hillary Mann Leverett, how do you see this ending, and what does a victory look like, given that this is not going to be what we understand as a conventional military confrontation?
You know, I think I'm the only one here who has actually negotiated with Iranian officials. I did so as a member of the Bush administration after 9/11 over Afghanistan. It was a relatively successful negotiation. At that time, nearly 20 years ago, I got to know now Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. For that period of time, for 20 years, Foreign Minister Javad Zarif has always wanted and has always looked for a negotiating path forward, a diplomatic path forward with the United States. That has been completely destroyed. Make no mistake, what the United States did, what President Trump did, was a direct attack on the core leadership of the Islamic Republic of Iran. He has unified the factions within Iran against any negotiation with the United States, and he's unified their determination to expel U.S. forces from the region. It may not happen tomorrow, but President Trump may go down just as President Carter did. That's what the Iranians are looking for, a humiliating defeat for what is a real test of the Islamic Republic of Iran, an attack on their core leadership.
Okay, and finally, Andreas, Krieg, your final thoughts on this. Is diplomacy dead, or is there still a chance to resolve this in a relatively peaceful manner?
Well, I do agree that this was an attack at the heart of the Islamic Republic, and the Islamic Republic is with its back against the wall amid, protests and economic crisis. The question is, if they move forward now, are they willing to escalate? Because escalation is not going to serve the Iranians well either. And they're very strategic and they're very calculated in their responses. Unlike the Trump administration, I think they're a lot more strategic, long-term thinking with strategic depth and strategic patience. I do think that the Iranians will see that there is a pathway forward for negotiation, but only after a retaliatory strike that is proportionate to that type of strike that we've seen on Friday.
OK, lots of food for thought, a discussion that surely will continue over the coming days and months. But for now, thank you very much indeed to all our guests, Hilary Mann Leverett, Andreas Krieg and Adolfo Franco. Thank you too for watching at home. You can see the programme again anytime, of course, by visiting the website aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, just head to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story, or tweet me directly. I'm @Halla Mohieddeen. But for now, from me and the whole team here in Doha, it's bye-bye.